Hello, I'm Richard Seltzer. I'd like to share with you a story from my book, To Gether Tales, which will soon be published by All Things That Matter Press. In the book, the narrator, in the midst of the pandemic, thinks back to a 7-day Caribbean cruise he was on a few years before, on which 8 people shared a dinner table and swapped stories every night. The narrator laments that with social distancing and mask wearing, love at first sight may no longer be possible. Imagine that you're on that cruise and the story is told by someone sitting across from you at the dinner table. The story is entitled, Thanks for the Mammaries. Bob was an advertising executive with a bright future ahead of him in sales of women's undergarments, especially brasiers. Starting in the art department, he had won praise and promotion for the beauty of the female forms he drew, especially the breasts. He drew small, firm breasts, pert, sexy breasts, and full, round breasts. But above all, he was a master of large, voluptuous breasts that seemed on the brink of bursting out of the narrow confines of bra, blouse, or dress, the huge breasts of showgirls and strippers. The other aspiring ad men he bypassed in his rapid rise to the executive ranks vented their envy by nicknaming him Bob the Boob. He countered by making breast jokes and expounding breast philosophies. He referred to the mammary protuberance as the fountain of youth. He claimed that it was the true symbol of the American nation. Mae West in the spirit of the West, Marilyn Monroe in the American dream. A huge burgeoning breast was the natural symbol of the forward-looking, striving vitality of the nation, its hopes, its aspirations. Bob was engaged to Sandra, a charming girl in all ways but one. Her breasts were small. He could call them firm, even pert. He could aesthetically appreciate their shape and the way they went so well with her shape, but they were not the voluminous, unaesthetic, bold, fleshy swellings that had captured his imagination. He tried to be reasonable. There was no mistaking Sandra's beauty of person and form, but he craved that abundance, that superabundance, that fleshly counterpart of the expansive vitality of America itself. Bob was convinced that with larger breasts, Sandra would be more aggressive, self-reliant, vigorous, so much more the perfect wife for a young advertising executive with a bright future ahead of him. Being a true American, he did not simply resign himself to the situation, rather he did everything in his power to change it. After long months of study of the physiobiochemistry of the female breast, he developed a chemical that he believed could reactivate the growth cells of the breast and enable breasts that had been stunted to fill out to their natural abundant dimensions, rather than insert foreign matter and artificially prop up the living tissue. This method allowed the breasts to literally grow. When the experiments he performed with chimpanzees were uniformly successful, he told Sandra about it. Sandra was taken aback. She was, of course, aware that her breasts were below average in size, but since high school days, she had learned to get along with her disability, had learned to choose the clothes that would accentuate her more positive features, and had eventually ceased to think about the size of her breasts. But from Bob's enthusiasm, Sandra could easily guess how much their size meant to him. For herself, she was content to remain as she was. She was suspicious of wonder-working drugs and chemicals, and as he explained his method, she couldn't help but think of hybrid tomatoes and pumpkins growing to the size of houses. She wanted to laugh, but she didn't want to hurt his feelings, and she hoped that even if the experiment didn't succeed, and she was sure it wouldn't, the effort would cure him of his obsession, and they would be able to live together happily ever after. She let him give her the first injection. After a week, nothing noticeable had happened. After 2 weeks, Bob grew impatient and gave her another, much larger injection. A week more with no results, and he injected her again. She felt sure that when it didn't work this time, he would stop and all would be well. For another week, nothing happened. But instead of accepting defeat, Bob became morose and buried himself in his basement laboratory, determined to perfect the treatment. Sandra was dismayed to hear that he hadn't perfected it before he tried it on her. She was still more dismayed at how little attention he paid to her now, and how surly he was when he did see her. She wanted to hate him, but she wound up hating herself, hating her small breasts. She lay in bed whole days at a time, staring at the ceiling or in the mirror across the room where she saw the two pitifully small lumps that lay so lifeless and blah on top of her ribs. 2 months after the first injection, she thought she noticed a change. It scared her to think that she had become so obsessed that her eyes were playing tricks on her. She tried to pull herself together and go back to her normal pattern of life. A week later, a tape measure confirmed that her bust was a full inch larger. She didn't tell Bob. Another week passed, and she put on 2 more inches. She wasn't sure if the overall effect was becoming, but they were now statistically at least average, and considered separately from the rest of her, they were attractive. At least Bob would be pleased, she was sure of that. She didn't mention what was happening the few times he called. He was so busy with his advertising work and his experiments that a month passed without him seeing her. More time would have passed, but she got scared. Her breasts continued to grow, slowly but steadily, and her bust was now 36. The problem wasn't their size, but their shape. They'd grown irregularly, grown in length without growing commensurately in width. They hung limply and painfully, for she wasn't used to supporting such weight. It was awkward for her to do anything but lie in bed, as she had done before when her breasts had been so hatefully yet comfortably small. Sandra called Bob and as calmly as she could explained that his experiment had worked, but not as planned. He was ecstatic. Even when he saw her, he was ecstatic. With complete confidence, he gave her new injections near the base of her breast. At first, his confidence seemed justified, as the breasts did, in fact, fill out and become full and round, and in succeeding weeks, they grew still more, to the huge, voluptuous breasts of a showgirl or stripper. Bob was in paradise, proud of his achievement. His dream was being fulfilled, the American dream. He called Sandra his butterfly and lavished her with praise and love. She didn't know what to think. She was proud that he was proud, pleased that he was pleased, but she was uncertain that it was over, that her breasts had stopped growing. And they hadn't. Bob remained proud and enthusiastic as they rose to 41 inches, 42, 43. When the tape indicated 44, he made a joke about the Guinness Book of Records. At 45, he joked about Ripley's Believe It or Not. At 46, he announced more positively than before that the growth had reached its peak. At 48, he was clearly uneasy. He came up with excuses for why they shouldn't go out together in public. But the breasts continued to grow. At 52, he called in specialists, doctors, biologists, sexologists, endocrinologists, biochemists, and physiobiochemists. He had first told them that this growth had just happened, but the forlorn look in Sandra's eyes made him break down and confess that he was guilty. It was his experiment. He explained in full what he had done. The doctors and scientists were amazed and congratulated him on his success and speculated on the scientific and market value of the discovery. They could offer no antidote, but rather stared in awe and even reverence at those huge breasts bursting with vitality. At 53, newsmen and photographers started besieging their apartment. Sandra was offered movie contracts by 3 major studios. At 54, he was determined to stop this growth before it became hideous or even fatal. He called in world-famous plastic surgeons, but they stared in awe. When they said they could do nothing, Bob wasn't sure whether this was a limitation of science or if they couldn't bring themselves to touch with a knife what must have been the most voluptuous breasts the world had ever seen. They continued to grow. Sandra could no longer lie on her back because the weight on her chest was painful and made breathing difficult. They continued to grow. All of New York City followed their growth on the front page of the Daily News, and then even of the New York Times. At 60, a sketch of Sandra's breasts made the cover of Time magazine. At 65, her breasts overshadowed the Grand Tetons on the cover of the New Yorker. Bob and Sandra became the most famous couple in America. Sales of bras doubled and tripled, and Bob's advertising company prospered in equal proportion. The whole nation had focused its attention on Sandra's bust, but the breasts continued to grow. A special platform had to be built to support them. A Las Vegas nightclub owner offered Sandra $1 million contract just to lie supine on his stage. Bob turned down that offer and all the movie contracts. He also turned down an offer of a vice presidency at his advertising company and quit his job. He spent all his days sitting by Sandra, tending to her needs, and with her, staring in awe at the ever-growing, ever-swelling breasts. After a couple months, the media lost interest. It was always the same story. The breasts were always growing. They were always the largest breasts the world had ever seen. But 6 months later, those same breasts once again forced themselves in the consciousness of New Yorkers and Americans. They burst through the walls of the apartment, and the walls of the building, and the walls of the neighboring building. They were growing now at an alarming rate. You could see them swell like balloons, all the while maintaining their perfect voluptuous shape. Bob was first interviewed, then apprehended by police. He laughed hysterically but refused to say a word. The newspapers concluded that he had gone mad and had given the breasts a new and even more powerful set of injections. He was detained at Bellevue for observation. Sandra, the person, seemed to have disappeared. No one could see anything but these twin mounds of perfectly proportioned flesh. But while the newspapers speculated, the breasts kept growing. A foot an hour, a yard an hour, a yard and half an hour, 10 minutes, a single minute. Soon all of Madison Avenue was in ruins, but no one dared raise a hand against the breast. A millionaire went so far as to have his skyscraper leveled by wrecking machines before the breasts reached it, for fear that they might be bruised in the effort by themselves. But he need not have worried. Nothing could stop them. Soon all of New York was in ruins. Philosophers in Paris speculated in the meaning of the event, the dynamic relationship between quantity and quality, the transformation of object to subject, passive to active, the pour soi to en soi. Artists in Chicago greeted the breasts as living pop art. Southern Baptists claimed the end of the world was at hand. Women's rights groups hailed the beginning of the end of the exploitation of women. Thousands gathered in the Boston Common carrying breast power signs. Students at Berkeley went on strike to express their solidarity with the breasts. Students from Columbia marched in the wake of the breasts, singing, "We shall overcome." Harlem residents chanted, "Grow, baby, grow," as their homes were leveled. A House subcommittee was formed to investigate the matter, and still the breasts continued to grow. Northern New Jersey was leveled. The normally conservative citizenry stared in dumbstruck awe at the power and magnificence of those mountains of voluptuous flesh. Blacks and Puerto Ricans, the poor and the young, sang and danced and chanted and bared their breasts in solidarity with this natural force that was rising up in their midst and leveling the nation. Church-going old ladies were seen bowing down and praying to the breasts. Foreign tourists and pilgrims began arriving in droves. The sale of brassieres reached critically low levels as bras were burned in bonfires across the nation. Finally, a group of businessmen decided that the situation was getting out of control. Congress was too slow to act, and the Department of Defense dared not use force against the symbol of motherhood, apple pie, Hollywood, Madison Avenue, and the American way. They flew to India seeking a solution. Within weeks, just as the breasts were leveling both New Haven and Philadelphia, and brassiere sales had dropped to zero, an Indian Brahman designed and built a huge brassiere. A fleet of B-52s airlifted the bra from India and dropped it on the mighty breasts. Silence fell upon the crowd, upon the millions of refugees, upon the millions of demonstrators. The steady advance had lasted for nearly 2 months. Many were cold and hungry. Many were hoarse with cheering and chanting. No one moved. No one spoke. All watched anxiously as the breasts strove to burst out of the bra, watched, in the words of a French philosopher who had come to America to experience the advance of this extraordinary revolutionary movement, the battle of form and matter. When, after 3 days, the bra was still intact, people began to accept the fact that the breasts had been contained. They would grow no more. The revolution came to a standstill. It had lost its impetus, its vital driving force. Millions were homeless. The industrial and commercial capital of the world was buried beneath these extraordinary mammary mountains. the slow work of relocating and rebuilding began. Eventually, the nation returned to normalcy. The peaks of progress became part of the landscape, an American monument and a tourist attraction. I hope you enjoyed this story. It comes from To Gether Tales, a novel of mine that will soon be published by All Things That Matter Press. My name again is Richard Seltzer, as in Alka-Seltzer. My email is seltzer@seltzerbooks.com. All Things That Matter Press recently published 3 novels of mine: Parallel Lives, Beyond the Fourth Door, and Nevermind. You can find those all at Amazon as paperbacks and as ebooks. They can be read in any order. They are independent stories with overlapping theme and styles. Each presents a different view of reality, a different way of trying to make sense of the mysteries of life.